The wind had been howling through the mountain pass for hours when I first saw him. The glass doors at the front of the lodge rattled with every gust, snow piling up in waves against the steps. It was close to midnight. I was gathering empty mugs from the lobby when the automatic door opened just far enough to let in a figure. No sound except the storm behind him, and then the dull scrape of his boots across the tile. He didn't speak, didn't even shake the snow from his coat, just stood there watching the fire in the stone hearth like he had been walking toward it for a very long time. Let me know where you're listening from tonight. And if these late-night stories keep you company, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next one. My name is Dana Ellis. I was 37 at the time, working nights at a mountain lodge in Colorado. These weren't glamorous shifts. I poured coffee, checked in the stragglers who came through the snow, and tried to keep the place warm and quiet. Winters at the lodge could stretch on forever. Days would pass without a single new guest. The parking lot buried in white, the road half invisible under drifts. That night, though, we had one arrival. Just one. And for some reason, I still think about him even now, 19 years later. The storm had already closed most of the highway. By 10 o'clock, the last of the ski families had retreated to their rooms, leaving only the low hiss of the furnace and the occasional groan of wooden beams shifting against the cold. I was alone at the desk when the glass doors struggled open against the wind. He stepped inside without hesitation, as if he already knew we'd have a vacancy waiting. He was tall, but not imposing, wrapped in a dark overcoat with the collar turned up. A knit cap shadowed most of his face. I asked if he needed a room, and he nodded, slow, deliberate, as though the question had taken a moment to reach him. When he spoke, his voice was softer than I expected. Just 2 words. One night, nothing more. I handed him the form and a pen. He didn't fill in an address, didn't write a name. Only a mark across the line, almost like a slash. I slid the key card across the counter anyway, telling myself it wasn't the first time we'd had a traveler who wanted to stay private. He paid in cash. The bills were crisp and folded neatly like he had been carrying them for this purpose alone. Len Turner, our overnight maintenance man, happened to be in the lobby just then, tightening one of the rattling window latches. He gave me a look as the guest walked past, a quick flick of his eyes, the kind co-workers share when something doesn't sit right. Len was 50-ish, quiet himself, not the type to spook easily. But I noticed he followed the man with his gaze until the elevator doors closed. The snow thickened outside, burying the parking lot lamps in a pale blur. I kept thinking about the man's boots. They left almost no trace on the lobby floor. Just faint, damp marks that seemed to vanish faster than they should have. It unsettled me, though. I couldn't say why. Guests came and went every season, and most I forgot within a day. This one, I couldn't. Around 2 in the morning, the lodge was silent. I was filing receipts in the back office when Len stopped by. He leaned in the doorway, rubbing his hands together, and asked if I'd seen the new guest leave his room. I told him no, while Len said he had been making his rounds in the lower hall and swore he heard someone walking behind him, steady, deliberate footsteps that stopped when he turned. He figured it was the new guy, but when he checked, the hall was empty. We both laughed it off. Snowstorms can mess with your head. The wind funnels through the vents, the old beams shift, and the place feels like it's breathing around you. Still, Len suggested we take a walk together just to be sure the pipes weren't freezing in the East Wing. I agreed. Anything to break the monotony of the night. The East Wing was mostly vacant that week. Half the rooms had their curtains drawn tight, shadows flickering faintly from televisions left on for background noise. We walked slow, our footsteps muffled by the carpet. When we reached room 212, the one I had given the quiet man, Len paused. He frowned at the door. The light above the frame was flickering, buzzing faintly, though the bulb had been replaced just a week before. Worse, the door itself stood slightly ajar. I knew I had heard the lock click when the man entered hours earlier. Len pressed his ear close but shook his head. No sound from inside. I felt a prickle at the base of my neck. I knocked gently and called out front desk. Just checking the heat, no answer. I nudged the door open a little more. The room was empty. Bed neatly made. Suitcase nowhere in sight. No damp coat hung over the chair, no boots by the heater. It was as though no one had ever stepped inside. Len muttered that maybe the guy had decided to leave during the storm, but that didn't sit right with either of us. The parking lot was buried under nearly a foot of snow by then. No tracks, no headlights cutting through the white. His car, if he had one, wasn't there. We closed the door, locked it, and walked back toward the lobby. Neither of us spoke much, but both of us kept glancing behind as though expecting someone to fall in step. When we reached the desk, I checked the computer system. Room 212 still showed occupied. Payment logged one night reserved, but there was no record of a name, not even the crude mark he had scrawled on the form. Somehow the file was blank. Len stayed near the desk the rest of the shift, making small repairs that didn't need doing. I tried to focus on paperwork, but I couldn't stop picturing that man's stillness in the lobby, his eyes fixed on the fire. Morning came slowly, gray light pushing through the snow. Guests trickled into the dining room for breakfast, their voices breaking the long silence of the night. By the time the manager arrived at 8, the storm had eased. I went to check room 212 again. The door was locked this time, deadbolt thrown. Inside, everything looked untouched. Yet on the desk near the window sat the key card I had given him, placed squarely in the center, as if returned deliberately. No one saw him leave. No footprints outside, no record at the front desk, no trace in the system. Only the key card left behind in perfect silence. Even now, I sometimes wake at night remembering the way he stood in that lobby, still patient, as though he had been waiting for that fire, or for us. And I wonder what it meant that he left without a word, yet made certain I would find the key. I don't usually talk about this because it sounds simple when I say it out loud, and never feels simple when I remember it. Back then, I managed freight routes for a company that shipped parts to small shops up and down the Sierra foothills. I lived out of a suitcase most weeks and knew the smell of every brand of lobby coffee from Placerville to Oakhurst. The night I'm thinking about, I had been on Highway 49 too long, watching the tail lights ahead of me blur in a drizzle that never committed to real rain. Sonora's neon vacancy sign appeared through the mist around 10. I turned into a U-shaped motel, with peeling paint, a humming ice machine by the stairs, and a hand-lettered sign in the office window that said, "Night Bell, if unmanned." The clerk's name was Tony. He was somewhere in his late 40s with a sweatshirt that still held heat from the dryer and a way of speaking that made everything sound like a favor. The lobby smelled faintly of old lemons and dust. A space heater ticked in the corner and a TV on mute scrolled local headlines that nobody had asked to see. I asked for a room on the second floor so the trucks wouldn't wake me. Tony slid a key card sleeve across the counter and pointed with 2 fingers toward the outside stairwell. He kept the easy tone most night clerks use, but his eyes went to the side once, toward the monitor showing the second-floor walkway. Full, I asked mostly to say something human. "Not tonight," he said, tapping the monitor like a habit. "Just a handful. 210 for you. 209 is taken, so try not to set your bag down in front of that door. Lady inside doesn't like hallway noise." The air felt heavier for a reason I couldn't put my finger on. I said sure, and took the packet with my key card and the little map you never need. When I stepped back into the night, the drizzle had thinned to a smell. The upstairs walkway ran along the U with a low metal rail. Fluorescent bulbs buzzed over each door and turned the damp concrete a pale green. I rolled my suitcase slowly so it wouldn't clatter. Room 210 was near the end. I passed 209 on the way and noticed the curtain pulled tight except for a sliver near the edge, the kind of gap you leave when you want to see the lot without being seen. The television glow behind the fabric was too regular to be a show. It looked like a menu screen stuck on loop. There was a towel folded under the door as a draft strip, which I had seen plenty in winter, but the night wasn't cold enough to bother most folks. The door's security latch had a wedge of paper in it so the chain wouldn't fall and make noise if the door shifted. People who hate hallway noise sometimes do that. People who want to move fast do it too. My room smelled like shampoo and old air. The bedspread had the familiar pattern of blue squares trying to look cheerful. I clicked on the heater and stood by the window for a minute listening for trucks. The lot was quiet. That should have felt comforting, but quiet can press on you differently when you travel alone. I ate a granola bar, returned 2 emails, and called it a night with that stubborn traveler's promise to sleep anywhere, even if your body thinks it is still driving. It was 2:47 a.m. when the phone rang. I know the time because I checked the clock twice, thinking I had dreamed the first ring. The motel phones all sound the same, a flat, unhurried trilling, like it expects you will not answer. I picked up and said hello with the voice you use in strange rooms to sound like you belong there. No one spoke. I could hear a television somewhere far away, the soft, hollow kind of sound a speaker makes when it is playing to an empty room. I said hello again and caught only breath, not close to the receiver, just present. Then the line clicked and gave me silence as neat as a folded towel. You tell yourself, wrong number. Front desk glitch. Someone dialing out who hit the wrong button. I hung up and lay still, hearing the heater click as it decided how hard to work. The quiet after a call like that feels like a held breath you didn't know you were holding. I was almost back to sleep when a soft knock came from the walkway. Not at my door, one door over. 3 careful taps spaced in a way that made it feel like the knocker had counted the gap. Nothing followed. I waited for a voice to say housekeeping or front desk. The air handler in my room picked that moment to drone louder, and I turned it down so I could listen. A minute later, the same 3 taps came again. I sat up and looked through my peephole. The corridor was empty. I pressed my ear lightly to the wall we shared with 209. At first, I heard nothing. Then the faint scrape of something moved across carpet like a chair or a bag being pulled a few inches. That was all. After another minute, the television glow behind their curtain shifted from dim blue to a paler white, and the sliver closed a hair as if someone had settled the fabric with 2 fingers. Morning makes nights smaller. It always has. I went down for coffee around 7 and found Tony reading a printout that looked like call records. He glanced up and read me well enough to know I had not slept through. He lifted the printout a little like a shrug. Anything I should know about, I told him about the phone call and the knocks. I kept the voice level, not suspicious, just noting the kind of thing clerks want to know in case a guest complains. He nodded once and tapped the sheet. "That call looks like it came from room to room," he said, and then he tilted the paper away like he regretted saying it. "Could be a glitch. These old systems bounce around." We both looked at the monitor. The feed for the second-floor walkway showed the long line of doors in the pale morning. Room 209's curtain was tight with that same narrow slip of daylight showing at the edge. A housekeeping cart was parked 2 doors down, unattended. Tony reached under the counter and set 2 wrapped towels on it like he meant to bring them up, then changed his mind and slid them back. "You have someone in 209 long-term?" I asked. "Night to night," he said. "Pays cash at odd hours. Doesn't want anyone in the room. I've seen worse." He didn't elaborate and I didn't press. People who live in motels for a stretch have their reasons, and most of them don't want an audience. I took my coffee and went back upstairs to pack. On the walkway, I passed the housekeeping cart again. The housekeeper's name tag said Lucy. She nodded politely and looked past me toward 209 with the expression of someone deciding whether to knock. She hesitated, knocked once with the side of her fist, waited, and then slid an envelope under the door. Her hand came back quicker than it had gone in. I checked out after 8 and was halfway to the office when a sheriff's cruiser pulled into the lot. The deputy who stepped out had an even walk and the kind of face that people talk to without meaning to. The badge read Harlan. He greeted Tony by name, which told me he came by often enough to know the routine. I signed the receipt slowly and listened without looking like I was listening. Morning Officer Harlan said, "We had a call last night from a number that pinged here, then dropped. Likely nothing, but I'm supposed to put eyes on the second floor." Tony's mouth tightened. He handed over the call sheet. "Guest in 210 mentioned a misdial," he said, nodding toward me, in a way that was polite but not inviting. "And there's a lady in 209 who keeps to herself." Harlan glanced my way and gave a professional half-smile. "Mind if I head up?" No one minded. The 3 of us walked the outside stairs together, our steps sounding different on the damp concrete than they had in the night. At 209, Harlan knocked and announced himself in a voice that was firm without being loud. Nothing. He tried again and then looked at the bottom of the door where the towel strip lay. He asked Tony to call the room. Tony dialed on his cell rather than leave the walkway. From inside, the phone began to ring that same flat motel ring, and we all held our breath to hear if footsteps would answer it. The ringing went on long enough to feel wrong. Harlan asked Tony for the master key. Tony hesitated, then nodded and went to fetch it. When he returned, he set the small brass key on his palm like he had weighed it. "I can open," he said. "But if she complains, I need you here with me." They swung the door very slowly. The chain was set. Through the narrow opening you could see most of the room, and all of it looked too neat. The television glowed at a frozen menu for an input screen. A single coffee cup sat on the dresser with a lipstick mark that had dried to the color of old fruit. A folded envelope lay beside it. The bathroom light was on, and steam still fogged the mirror in a faint oval, which could have meant nothing more than someone showered an hour earlier. The air smelled like recent shampoo and that sharper motel cleaner that lingers behind it. Harlan asked Tony to close it back up. He didn't force the chain. He didn't push. He just looked, let the details set, and then knocked again. After another minute, he slid his card under the door with a note in block letters. "Call me when you're ready to talk," and we walked away like you do when the only tool left is patience. At the office, Harlan asked if he could see incoming plates from the night before. The cameras at that motel were old and pointed the wrong way, catching more glare off the neon than anything useful. We scrubbed through anyway. Around 2:30, a sedan rolled in and parked at the far corner where the lamplight didn't quite reach. The figure that stepped out wore a hood and stood too long looking up at the second floor. The shape never came past the trunk of the car, as if waiting for a signal. 10 minutes later, the sedan backed out and vanished, headlights still off. "Could be nothing," Harlan said quietly. "Could be everything." He wrote a number at the bottom of my receipt and told me to call if I remembered anything else, even something small. "People forget small things when they travel," he added. "Small things matter." I left before 9 and drove toward Angel's camp with the radio off. The road curved between pines that held last night's wet air like a smell, and the truck felt heavier than it should have. I told myself it was just the memory of that ring at 2:47 and the soft knock. But the feeling did not ride off with the morning. It sat on the seat beside me like a quiet passenger and stayed all day. A month later, I routed through Sonora again. You fall into the same places when you drive the same miles. I told myself I was stopping for a familiar bed and a sure price. I think I was stopping because I wanted the story to have turned out ordinary in my absence. The lot looked the same. The humming ice machine sounded exactly as I remembered. A different clerk sat behind the counter, younger, with earbuds tucked away as I came in. Tony, I learned, had switched to mornings after some health thing. The new clerk didn't know what I was referring to when I asked if 209 was quiet these days. He said the lock had been replaced, and that room was off the books for repairs until they got the paperwork straight. He said it lightly and moved on to my card. I took the second floor again, this time on the opposite end. The walkway paint had flaked more since my last visit, and someone had hit the stair rail with a cart hard enough to bend it. At 2:09, the curtain was closed, same as before, with a newer towel folded under the door. The peephole had a small square of tissue. Pressed into it from the inside, something I have seen in certain places where people feel safer stopping up every aperture that faces the hall. The television glow looked like it had not flickered in days. A small envelope lay on the floor inside the room, just visible through the gap under the door. It had slid out an inch, maybe 2, like someone tried to push it farther and changed their mind. I slept some that night and woke before I meant to. My phone lit by the bed at 2:47 with an unknown local number. I watched it buzz and go still without touching it. No voicemail followed, just the blue light fading and the sound of the ice machine dropping a load of cubes into no one's bucket. I stood at the window and looked toward the corner of the lot where the sedan had parked in the video. The space was empty. The lamplight still failed to reach that far, leaving a soft wedge of dark. In the morning, I asked the day clerk, who might have been Tony's age, if the sheriff had heard back from whoever was staying in 209 last month. He blinked like he was sorting different weeks. "Officer Harlan," he asked. "He stops in sometimes. Room 209's not occupied. Needs a latch repair. We're waiting on the part." He said it without malice or secrecy, but the words did not line up with the glow I had seen through the fabric the night before. I left my key on the counter and drove out with the radio off again. The highway curved the same way, and the pines smelled the same. Every few miles, I caught myself checking the rear view for headlights that stayed the same distance back. There were none. By afternoon, I had mostly convinced myself that nothing had happened, and that my mind had threaded a story through ordinary shapes. That is the trick of the road. It lets you file down the edges of a memory until it can be carried without cutting. I still route freight through Sonora sometimes, and the motel still stands with its soft green lights above the doors. I pass by more often than I pull in now. When I do stop, I ask for lower numbers and keep my curtains tight. If I climb the outside stairs for soda or ice, I make myself walk past 209 without slowing. The towel under the door is usually fresh. The glow through the curtain is usually that same pale menu that never chooses a channel. And every so often, when the walkway is quiet and the hour has slipped past midnight, I think I hear 3 careful taps spaced like someone counting at a door I am not supposed to open. The last real night job I ever had was managing a warehouse outside Allentown. It wasn't glamorous work. Just a cinder block building with flickering sodium lamps and loading docks that smelled faintly of cardboard oil and old coffee. But I knew the place better than anyone. Every echo of the forklift alarms and every draft that slid under the big steel doors after midnight. I'd been there long enough that the dark corners didn't bother me, and silence felt like part of the job. That changed when we brought on a new hire named Wesley. He was maybe mid-20s, wiry, with the kind of nervous energy that makes a person look over their shoulder too often. He said he wanted extra hours and didn't mind graveyard shifts, which made him useful in theory. Still, there was something about him I couldn't put my finger on. His eyes lingered too long on the aisles when he thought nobody was watching, and he had a way of pausing, like he was listening for something none of us could hear. That night in November, the crew clocked out by 10, leaving just me and Wesley to finish intake on a late truck. The storm outside had cleared, but the damp carried into the building, making the concrete slick near the loading bays. We went about the usual routine: break down pallets, log barcodes, move boxes to holding. Nothing unusual, except every so often I'd notice him glancing toward the far end of the warehouse, the one lit by a single buzzing fixture. That corner was always dim, the light too weak to cover the whole aisle. Around midnight, I told him to take his break while I handled the paperwork. He nodded and walked off, though not toward the break room. Instead, he drifted down the long aisle to that dim corner. I called after him that the vending machines were the other way, but he either didn't hear or chose not to. I figured maybe he just needed space. 20 minutes passed. I expected to hear footsteps or the hiss of the soda machine, but the warehouse was silent except for the low hum of refrigeration units. I finally set down my clipboard and walked toward the far aisle. As I got closer, the air felt cooler, almost damp, and the light above flickered in slow, uneven pulses. I rounded the corner and stopped. Wesley was standing perfectly still between two stacks of wrapped pallets facing the wall. His hands hung loose at his sides, not moving like he'd been waiting that way for a while. I called his name. He didn't answer. I asked if he was all right. Slowly, he turned his head, but not all the way toward me, just enough that I could see his profile. His expression was blank eyes fixed on something at floor level. I started to ask again, but before I could finish, he whispered, "They've been here before." The way he said it made my skin crawl. I asked what he meant, and he shook his head. He muttered something about marks on the floor. I looked down and noticed faint scuff lines on the concrete small half-circles, like something heavy had been dragged and turned. They weren't fresh, but I hadn't noticed them earlier. He crouched and traced one with his finger, whispering again that they didn't match any of the pallets. I told him to get up and take his break properly. He stood slowly, still watching that patch of floor. I guided him back toward the break room, but when I turned around again, I could have sworn the flickering light in that corner had gone completely out. By 1, I decided to finish paperwork in the office upstairs. I figured Wesley would calm down with a snack and some water. About half an hour later, I heard a loud crash echo from the floor below. It sounded like a pallet collapsing. I rushed down the stairs and ran to the source, only to find an aisle completely clear. No fallen boxes, no broken wrap, nothing disturbed. But the scuff marks on the concrete seemed darker now, as though something heavy had recently been dragged through. I called out for Wesley. No answer. I checked the break room. Empty. His jacket and backpack were still there. I searched the aisles row by row, the hum of the lights sounding louder than usual in the empty space. When I reached the far corner again, I noticed the light there flickering back on. Beneath it lay his handheld scanner, still powered the screen showing a single frozen barcode. Entry time stamped 1:47 a.m. No sign of him anywhere. I called the police. Officer Brewster arrived just before 3. He walked the aisles with me, shining his flashlight into every corner. No trace of Wesley. The building doors were still locked from inside security chain across the front. Nothing disturbed at the docks. He asked if the kid had any reason to run off, maybe personal trouble. I said nothing about the whisper in the aisle or the marks on the floor. Instead, I just pointed out that his bag was still in the break room. People don't walk out without their wallet or phone. They logged it as a missing person, though I could see in Brewster's face that he didn't expect much to come of it. He told me to call if anything turned up. I went back to that corner after the squad car pulled away. The light was buzzing steady again, throwing a pale circle over the concrete. The scuff marks were still there, but fainter as though rubbed down by passing wheels. I stood there for a long time wondering if Wesley had known something about that aisle that I didn't, or if he had simply slipped away in the silence. The warehouse has been renovated since brighter lights and polished floors, but whenever I drive by, I still picture him standing between those pallets, staring at the ground, like he was reading something written there that no one else could see. And every so often in the quiet between shifts, I imagine the sound of something heavy being dragged slowly across concrete, leaving marks that shouldn't be there. The last real quiet I remember was the kind you get in a hospital after midnight, when the hall lights dim and even the vending machines seem to whisper. I had worked nights long enough to know the building by temperature and echo. The emergency department ran warm and loud. The surgical wing kept a steady chill that bit through your shirt sleeves, and the old pediatric floor on level 3 carried a hollow sound that made you think of empty lockers. I walked those halls like a mail route badge, clipped to my belt radio on my shoulder, and a ring of keys that felt heavier when the weather turned. In November, the wind came down off the hills and pushed against the glass like it wanted in. Nothing unusual in that. Unusual started just before 2 in the morning, when the radio clicked and a voice, too small for our channel, asked if anyone could help him find his mother. I looked at Nora through the glass wall of security. She handled our dispatch and had the calm of a person who knows where every door leads. She shrugged and tapped her headset, like maybe the voice belonged to a paramedic testing a new handset. The channel stayed open long enough for a soft breath to come through, then nothing. We made a note of it and kept moving. People with scanners pick up strange things at night, and the building can throw back echoes you don't expect. At 2:47, the radio opened again. The voice was closer to the mic this time, and the sound carried a brittle hospital hush behind it, the kind you hear outside rooms where the blinds never open. He said he couldn't find his door. That was the whole sentence. Nora answered like she would any patient call, voice steady and kind, asking for a room number. The radio cracked once and gave us the kind of silence that isn't empty so much as waiting. I took the elevator to 3 without being asked. Pediatrics had been half-shuttered since spring. Most cases went to Charleston or down to Bluefield, leaving our floor with a skeleton night crew and a row of rooms used for overflow when the winter viruses rolled through. The overhead lights ran on a timer, so the corridor held a weak bluish glow that flattened everything into one shade of tired. Elena Ruiz was at the small desk near the playroom, charting with her sweater sleeves pushed to her elbows. She looked up when she heard my steps and gave that professional smile nurses keep for late hours and small storms. "Everything all right?" she asked. I told her about the radio and asked if anyone had a kid awake. She shook her head and leaned toward the hall like she was listening for a cry. The only sounds were the rumble of the ventilation and the clack of a distant ice machine trying to make itself useful. We walked the length of the corridor together, peeking through door windows and checking that each security latch had seated. All the rooms in use showed the same soft green monitor light, steady and slow. No alarms. The darkened rooms looked staged for a brochure, beds made too tight and chairs tucked just so. At the far end, where the unit curved toward a closed wing, the air felt a degree colder, like a door had been opened and shut before it could settle. I keyed into the playroom out of habit. The shelves held plastic cars lined in a row by color, and the couch cushion had a crease like someone had sat up from a long nap and put it back with 2 hands. Elena noticed a paper wristband under the couch, the old kind we stopped using years earlier, with a half-torn sticker that once held a name. She held it the way you hold a note you can't read anymore and set it on the desk without speaking. At 3, the elevator dinged without a call. The doors slid open against nothing and waited too long before closing again. Elevators do this at night, and you learn to ignore their ticks, but the timing scratched at me. I checked the control panel and ran my badge across the sensor, just to feel grounded by a beep. The scanner read clean. The call log showed no request. When the radio chirped a third time, Nora's voice slipped a little more careful than before. She asked again for a room number. The boy's voice came through in pieces, close enough to the mic that the consonants flattened, like he had cupped the radio with both hands. He said the numbers on the wall kept changing when he looked away. He said the fish on the ceiling were wrong. Elena and I looked up without meaning to and studied the glow-in-the-dark stickers that had hung there since before my time. A few had peeled back at the tails and turned gray along the edges. We split the hall. I walked the closed wing, even though it wasn't on my list. The door to 47 Delta, an old isolation room at the elbow of the unit, had a strip of masking tape over the lock from the last time maintenance painted. The tape had been pressed flat weeks earlier and had collected a fan of dust. I stared at that dust the way a person stares at footprints in snow, trying to decide what pattern makes sense. The air return above the door whistled once, short and thin, as if someone had taken a careful breath and let it go. I called Nora and asked her to check whether any portable radios had been signed out for pediatrics that night. She said no, and added that she had just gotten a ping from one of the old maintenance transceivers down in storage, the kind they retired when we upgraded. Its ID flashed once in the system and then went dark. You can spend years in a building without meeting all its ghosts, which is a figure of speech until you hear a child ask you to stay on the line. Officer Danner rolled up around 4 because that is the hour paperwork turns to a phone call. He was the kind of cop who kept his coat unbuttoned and his questions simple. He listened while I ran through the details and asked if the hospital had ever had a case involving a missing child. He meant legally missing, not the kind where a parent walks off the unit to smoke and comes back 6 minutes later. Elena glanced down the hall and told him there had been a boy some years back. A transfer went sideways and paperwork took longer than it should have, and the boy's mother left the unit at shift change and never returned. The record called it a family discharge. The nurses called it what it felt like. We stood at the window across from 47 Delta and watched our reflections in the glass. The fish on the ceiling didn't glow anymore. The playroom cars kept their line. The elevator made no new choices on its own. I walked the unit a final time before first shift arrived, hands in my jacket pockets trying not to think about dust and tape and the way a radio can sound like a person at your shoulder. I went home to sleep at 8 and barely dipped under before the phone rattled on my nightstand. Nora's name filled the screen. She wanted to know if I could come in early that night. She had played the overnight recordings for maintenance to prove we weren't imagining the channel, and the tech found a historical tag we had missed at the edge of the log. The calls had not come from our dispatch band at all. They had ridden in on a bleed from a repeater, never properly decommissioned one mounted behind the closed wing, wired long ago, to a handful of portable units. Old systems do this when they are asked to be quiet too fast. They whisper in the rafters. I came in early and met the tech behind the locked door that separated new pediatrics from old carpet. The repeater sat on a shelf like a loaf pan with wires half covered by a drop cloth. He shined his light across the panel and found a hairline crack in the casing, enough to let air and dust bend the contacts when the ventilation kicked. He killed the power and shook his head like the building had told a joke. We stood there longer than the job required because the silence pressed back in a way that felt personal, as if someone had said, "Finally," and meant all of it. We would have left it there if Elena had not set the wristband on my desk the next night. She had written a date in small, careful print on one edge and a first name on the other because she remembered it from the old chart kept in records. Caleb, she wrote, then paused before the last letter, like she was asking permission from someone not in the room. I told her we didn't have to put the band back where we found it. She said she knew. She asked if we could leave it in 47 Delta just for one night with the door propped and the lights low. I said we could, and we did. At 2:47, the radio cracked in our dead channel again. Not a voice this time. Only a short, careful breath and the faint sound of a mobile dangling tag tapping a side rail. The kind every hospital bed has, the kind you stop hearing after a week on the job. The sound came once, then fell away like a child testing whether you still stood at the door. I went to 47 Delta and leaned against the frame and said I could stay until the next round. Elena sat in the playroom with the cars still in order. The elevator stayed where it was told. In the morning, the wristband lay on the chair under the window, not where we had left it, folded neatly in half like a thank you note, written by someone who had not learned to write yet. No one else had been on the unit except a respiratory therapist who waved tiredly at the camera at 3 and a housekeeper who moved silent as habit and never cut through closed wings. We put the wristband in a small envelope and slid it into records with the name on the line where names go. There were no more voices after that, not the way we had heard them. The repeater stayed dead. The channel closed like a book shut flat. We filled our nights with the usual small urgencies, and winter did what winter does to a hospital. Months later, a woman stopped at the security desk with a question about visiting hours. She had that searching look people carry when they have returned to a place they once lived in for too many nights. She asked whether the fish still glowed in pediatrics. I said they did when the lights went out and the air was still. She nodded like that answer mattered, and set a toy car on the counter, the cheap metal kind you buy in a pack blue with a white stripe. She asked if there was a shelf anywhere for things left behind. I told her we had a small one by the chapel with a sign that said, "Please return to who needs this most." She thanked me and walked away without giving a name. I placed the car in the playroom that night on the low shelf below the window, because that is where small hands go first. The cars in the line shifted by one space, as if made by an impatient child, and I told myself I had not left them that way. At 2:47, I stood near 47 Delta and thought I heard the gentle rattle of a tag against a rail again, but it could have been the ventilation or the sound of my own breath asking not to be alone. I still work nights sometimes, filling in when someone's kid has a recital or a fever. The building is brighter now, but certain corners keep their weather. When I walk past the old wing, I feel a degree of cool that makes me think of winter coats and small hands tightening around blanket edges. Every so often, if I linger longer than my list allows, the elevator opens without a call and waits the exact length of a child's patience. I do not step inside. I stand in the doorway and keep the radio close, listening for a voice that learned how to be quiet once and may not need anything from me anymore, except to hear someone breathing back. The strangest stretch of my life happened when I worked nights at a gas station off Highway 285. I had taken the job in the spring of 2022 mostly because it kept me from thinking too much. My marriage had ended the year before, and I was still carrying around that quiet kind of loneliness you don't notice until you realize no one's keeping track of when you get home. The station itself was nothing remarkable. A pair of islands under flickering lamps, a 24-hour convenience store with too many cameras, and a steady trickle of truckers and night drifters who liked to buy cigarettes with crumpled bills. I came in at 10 and worked until sunrise, watching the road glow and fade like a living thing. Routine is the best thing and worst thing about that job. You start to expect the rhythm the trucks idling through at 1 the shift in temperature, when the mountain air drops at 3, the first farmer's pickup rolling in just before dawn. It was during that spring when I started noticing a new rhythm, one that was too precise to be chance. At exactly 3:17 every morning, the same car pulled into Pump 4. I didn't notice it the first night or even the second, but by the third, the timing stuck with me. The headlights would swing in from the northbound lane, cutting across the empty lot like they were following a ruler. The car was an older sedan, silver maybe, though under those yellow lamps, colors never looked right. The driver wore a blue hoodie with the drawstrings pulled so tight I couldn't even make out his face. He'd stop the car, step out, and buy $12 of gas, never a cent more, never less. Then he'd drive off south without glancing inside the store. $12. That became the only thing I knew about him. It was never 12 gallons, never a round number to match the pump. Always $12. I'd watch the numbers climb, and he'd stop it sharp like he'd rehearsed the exact motion of his hand. The first week I didn't think much about it. Plenty of folks have habits that make no sense except to them. But after 2 weeks, I started to wait for him timing my trash runs and coffee breaks, so I'd be standing at the counter when those headlights turned in. The station cameras picked him up just fine, though his hood shadowed his face in every frame. He walked with a kind of deliberate pace, not slow, not hurried, just measured as if each step had been planned. Once, after he drove away, I rewound the footage to see if he ever looked toward the glass. He didn't. Not once. It was like the store the cameras. Even me standing at the register didn't exist in his world. By the second month, I mentioned it to Nora, the dispatcher we called when anything odd came up. She laughed at first, told me I was just getting too used to patterns, but I asked her to log it anyway, just in case. She humored me, writing it down like she was taking a weather report. The next morning, when the headlights appeared at 3:17 on the dot, I felt a knot in my stomach. Routine can feel comforting until it starts feeling scripted. Then came the night he didn't show. I remember checking the clock. 3:10 to 15 to 17, and the lot stayed empty. I stood at the window longer than I should have, staring at the dark stretch of highway, listening to the hum of the soda machine behind me. At 3:20, I told myself it was nothing. People change routes, cars break down. Maybe he just found a new station. But the quiet had a different weight that night, like the building itself was holding its breath. The following night, he returned. Same car, same hoodie, same $12. The only difference was that he looked toward the window as the pump clicked off. Just once, quick as a photograph, but I knew he was looking straight at me. The hood still covered most of his face, but the gesture carried weight. I didn't breathe until his tail lights disappeared down the southbound lane. After that, it stopped being routine and started feeling personal. He never changed the timing, never the amount, but every third or fourth night he'd glance toward the glass. I couldn't shake the idea he was checking to make sure I was still there, like I was part of his routine as much as he was part of mine. I tried talking to a trooper who stopped by one morning for coffee. He listened politely, wrote down a few details, and asked if I had the plates. That was the strange part. I'd tried to get them more than once, but every time the headlights swung in or the angle of the car passed the camera, the plate glare wiped it clean. Even standing at the window, I could never make out more than a blur of numbers that didn't add up to anything. The trooper said maybe the plate cover was scuffed, or maybe the lights were catching it wrong. He told me to keep an eye on it, but not to worry. People are creatures of habit, he said. Still, the thing about habits is they eventually slip. I knew it would, and I half dreaded, half waited for it. One night in late April, I got my answer. The car pulled in late. Not by much, 3:20 instead of 3:17, but enough that I noticed. He stepped out like always, hood drawn, hands steady. But when he finished pumping, he didn't get back into the car right away. He stood there, one hand resting on the roof, and turned his head toward the store window. This time, he didn't look quickly. He looked for as long as it took me to look away. When I glanced back, he was gone. Not in the car, not at the pump, not anywhere the cameras could see, just gone. The sedan sat there with the nozzle back in place, and then before I could make sense of it, the tail lights came on. The car pulled out of the lot and disappeared south, even though no one had opened the door. I replayed the footage until the sun came up, scrubbing frame by frame. The man stepped out, pumped $12, turned his head, and vanished. No door opening, no blur, no glitch, just gone. The trooper who came by the next day said it was probably camera error. I knew better. I had watched it with my own eyes, not just through the monitor. For weeks after I waited every night at 3:17. Sometimes the car came, sometimes it didn't. When it did, it always followed the same script, though I never again saw the man step out. The pump clicked, the numbers froze at 12, and the car drove away. No figure, no sound. Just the machine doing its work like an invisible hand guided it. Nora stopped humoring me after a while. She said strange reports stack up on highways, and most don't mean anything. But when I asked her what to do if the car pulled in again, she told me to write down the time, the pump number, and whether anyone else was there to see it. She didn't say what she believed, and I didn't press her. The last time I saw the sedan was late May. The headlights swung in sharp and deliberate, but instead of stopping at pump 4, it rolled across the lot and idled in front of the store. The driver's seat was empty. I watched from behind the counter, too afraid to move, while the car sat humming for what felt like an hour, but was maybe 30 seconds. Then it backed out slow, turned toward the highway, and disappeared south. I gave my notice the next week. I told the owner I needed something with better hours, but the truth was I couldn't keep standing in front of that glass at 3:17 every night, waiting for headlights that carried no driver. I still drive past that station sometimes, and when I do, I look toward pump 4. The lamps above it flicker worse than the others, and sometimes I catch myself checking the clock on my dashboard, half expecting it to read 3 17. I've told myself more than once that maybe I just filled in the blanks wrong, that maybe grief and routine can twist the night into shapes that aren't really there. But then I think about the tape I watched the pump freezing at 12, with no one standing beside it, and I know better. Some habits don't belong to the living. I spent most weeknights along the river where the city turns. From glass to brick, and the roads smell like wet steel after midnight. I liked those hours because the fares were quiet. The traffic thinned to long strings of orange lights, and the dispatch radio sounded like a distant kitchen fan. You learn a city differently from the driver's seat at night. The blocks have their own weather, and the railroad crossings breathe in a way no one notices in daylight. I kept my cab, cleaned my dome light off, unless someone asked, and a thermos of coffee wedged by my knee that tasted like it had spent the day inside a radiator. It paid the bills, and the stillness helped my mind settle in a way daylight never could. The call that changed the rhythm came on a Tuesday in late fall. Dispatch pinged a pickup at a loading dock off Guinot. Not a listed address, just a set of coordinates tucked between the river and a block of shuttered brick. It wasn't unusual for a rider to drop a pin in the wrong place, and I answered because the screen showed 10 minutes, and the night felt steady. The fog rolled low along the river and pushed against the cab windows like a cold breath. The sodium lamps along the fence hummed in that tired way they do when metal is colder than it wants to be. A man stood under the only working lamp when I pulled in, hands in the pockets of a black coat with a collar turned up high. He didn't wave me down or hurry. He opened the rear door and slid in without looking at me, a smooth motion like he had practiced it. The seat belt never clicked. I asked the destination, and he said, Nicholson and 41st Voice, even like it was nothing, though I knew that corner only as a long chain-link shadow behind an old manufacturing plant. I repeated it back because it didn't track as a place a person would go at 2 in the morning. He said yes in the way people do when you've asked a question you didn't need to ask. We rolled past the rail yard, where the switch engines dragged their small constellations. The streetlights shrinking to cones that didn't touch. He didn't smell like booze or cologne. The air around him was clean and faintly cold, like he'd been outside a long time. I kept my voice level and asked if he needed a specific gate. Outer road, he said. Stay off the river lanes. It wasn't a route people usually requested unless they knew the old turns, and he gave the kind of directions that landed on the next step before I needed them. Right at the grain silos. 2 lefts after that. Don't stop on the tracks. A freight horn blew somewhere near the river. The sound came through the glass like a thumb pressed in the soft part behind your ear. At the first crossing, the gates were up, but the signal lights blinked a steady red, and I slowed anyway, because you never argue with a blinking red after midnight. The passenger leaned forward just enough that I felt his breath on the back of my neck, not warm so much as present. You don't stop on rails, he said, not like a warning, more like a rule a child would repeat. He didn't talk after that. I watched him in the mirror the way drivers do, eyes flicking back and forth, so it looks like the road owns all your attention. The hood of his coat threw his face into shadow. You could make out a chin, maybe a mouth, but the light never found him. I turned the radio down until it was just a thread. Dispatch asked if anyone had eyes on a drifting semi near the Paseo Bridge, and a voice I didn't recognize answered that it had pulled to the shoulder. That kind of conversation usually fills a driver with a feeling of being part of a net. That night it ran past us like water. He tapped the glass once when we passed a closed gas station on Independence. "Stop there," he said, and his palm left no mark on the window. The lights inside were off, but a clerk moved behind the counter with the flat pace of someone halfway through a long shift. I pulled under the canopy and left the engine running, because I don't cut it at 2 in the morning unless someone tells me why. The passenger said, "Turn it off." Voice the same even tone as before. I shut the key because I have learned not to argue with voices that don't change. The clerk unlocked the door as I approached. He kept his eyes on a spot over my shoulder like he was reading rules on the wall that weren't there. "Cash only," he said before I'd asked for anything. I told him we were just passing through and asked if I could grab a coffee. He nodded toward the burners, and then he whispered without moving his mouth, "Much at all. Don't linger if you're taking him out east." I asked what he meant, and he shook his head fast, a small movement like he regretted even that. When I paid, he took the bills like my hand might burn him and said very softly, "2 blocks past Nicholson. There's no shoulder. Keep the car moving." Back in the cab, the passenger hadn't shifted. The dome light didn't trip when I opened the door, though it had worked 15 minutes earlier. "Ready?" I asked because it felt like the only word that fit. He didn't nod or speak, but the air had that feeling you get when someone who has been waiting stands up in their mind. I started the engine, and we threaded east, the street changing from a line of tired storefronts to blank brick that swallowed light. He told me to take a turn I would not have taken a cut between 2 buildings. With windows boarded so long ago, the plywood had turned gray. The tires hissed past uneven patches, and the cab shivered it all into the steering column. The plant at Nicholson and 41st had been closed for years. I'd driven past it enough to recognize the faded name bolted high above the dock doors, letters missing like a mouth with teeth knocked out. The front gate was chained. The outer gate to the loading dock was often ajar because no one had taken the time to fix a sag in the hinge. That night it stood half open, chain looped without a lock. I eased through and followed his instruction to stop by the second bay, the one with the black number stenciled crooked on the concrete. "Engine off," he said, and the words carried the thunk of a routine too familiar to resist. He opened the rear door and stepped out without catching the door against the wind. The dome light stayed dead, and the cold air scraped in around my shoulders. He walked to the bay door and put his hand on the seam where metal met metal, and the door shifted upwards a few inches like it had been guided by a helper inside. He didn't look back. He went in with a steady pace, not hurried, not tentative, the way people go through doors they have used before. I told myself to check the time, because time is what you hold when you don't have anything else. The meter read 241 climbing cents, the way a meter does when it feels ignored. Waiting at docks is part of the job. You drop a fare at an unlocked bay for a cash handoff or a forgotten badge, and the night eats 10 minutes before you can feel it. I sipped my coffee, lukewarm now, and watched steam spider up the windshield from my breath. 10 minutes passed, then more. The meter clicked past 3 digits in quiet, precise steps. The plant sat around me like a big animal that had fallen asleep with its eyes open. I rolled the window a crack. The air that came in had a taste like cold oil and cardboard. Somewhere inside, metal tapped metal in a rhythm too slow to be a machine. At 3:03, I got out because I told myself I was an adult, and that adult meant knowing when to knock. The rear door on my side sat unlatched by a hair, and I pushed it to settle it, but it drifted open again, as if gravity changed when I let go. On the seat lay a plastic visitor tag flattened by years, the kind that clips to a pocket, the logo worn to a ghost shape. A date had been printed in pale blue, beneath the logo a decade old, and you would have missed it if not for the way the numbers reflected the street light in choppy squares. I picked it up, and the plastic felt colder than the air. I set it back down because the back of my neck tightened, the way it does when a door behind you decides something. I walked to the bay where he had gone in and called out that I was on the clock. It's the sentence drivers use to open a door without sounding scared. The sound that came back was not an echo so much as a room remembering the noise I had made. I bent and looked into the 3-inch gap. The air on the other side fell across my face with the measured temperature of a place that never warms. I saw the edge of a pallet jack, a coil of hose, and the corner of a sign flipped face down. From deeper in the building came the soft scrape of something moved across concrete, followed by the faintest rattle of a hanging chain. "Sir," I said, because that is a word that calls people back from their own heads. Nothing answered me in a human voice. The chain rattled once more and settled like a breath from a person trying not to disturb anyone. I backed up toward the cab with my hands up like I had been asked to leave politely. The dome light flicked on for a half-second with no door open, a strong, clear rectangle of yellow, and then it went dark so fast it left a shadow behind. The meter beeped and froze on a number I didn't understand, until the second beep wrote it clean $1,200 paid. No card swipe sounded, no cash had been handed. The screen settled there like the verdict in a simple case. I sat behind the wheel and called dispatch because you have to bring a second voice into a night like that, or it will teach you the wrong lesson. 2 officers rolled in 20 minutes later, with that posture cops carry when they already know there will be nothing to write up. They walked the dock with their flashlights and found the chain looped at the front gate and dust on the bar like no one had touched it since the last wind. The bay door would not move for them. One officer set his palm flat above the seam and pushed. The metal gave a sigh and nothing rose. He shined his light through and called out a solid professional voice. What returned was the sound of an empty plant holding the night steady. I told them about the man's voice and the directions and the gate I had driven through. They looked at my tires and showed me my own tracks cutting through a film of dust that ended halfway from the gate like someone had poured it there and not told me why. The younger officer asked if I had a dash cam. I did, and we watched the footage on the hood of the cab with the engine ticking cool. The rear door opened in the video. It closed. The seat behind me stayed empty. The meter ticked, and when it froze at $12, the beep on the video matched the beep in my memory. They were kind in the way people are when there is nothing useful to do. One of them told me to avoid Nicholson after midnight, until the city finally took a bulldozer to the place. I nodded like that was a plan. I drove back toward the river with the heater low, and when I passed the Independence station, the clerk was out front dragging a trash bag. He looked up, then looked past me like he was reading that same wall. He raised his hand to report that the night existed, and then turned away before his arm finished the motion. For a week, the pin on Guinot didn't light up. Then it started appearing on my screen again, at the edges of the hour, when the river breathes always just a buzz, no rider name, no text. I didn't answer them. Sometimes a person doesn't need another repetition to know the shape of a thing. On certain nights, I still take fares near the river, because you can't give every corner to the part of you that wants to be small forever. When I pass that stretch with the chain link and the single lamp that hums, I keep my eyes on the green light ahead. The visitor tag rides in my glove box because I haven't found the right trash can yet, and because the plastic feels colder than it should when the rest of the car is warm. The meter behaves most nights. Now and then it wakes on its own when the cab is still and writes a number that makes no math, then clears like a person thought better of speaking. If I'm stopped at a red on a quiet night and the freight horn blows from the river, I don't look in the mirror. The lights along the fence don't reach the back seat. Some corners in a city never learn the day's language, and you do not teach them. You roll forward when it turns green, and you do not stop on the rails. I don't know what to make of nights like that, except that they sit beside the others in a line I can't quite ignore. A lodge buried under weather, where a traveler left less than a footprint. A motel room that stayed occupied long after the guest vanished from the system. A warehouse aisle where a man studied marks on the floor until he was gone. A hospital wing that knew a voice more clearly than a name, and a gas pump that met a routine no living driver kept. They all felt ordinary, right up until the second they didn't. None of those places asked for a story. They were meant for sleeping, working, waiting, and passing through, but the hours that live between 2 and 4 give them a different job. That's when a building tells you what it remembers. The details are small and stubborn. A knock that knows the number of taps, a door that opens just enough, a meter that decides the fare before you do. I think the truth is quieter than most people want. It isn't monsters, and it isn't a twist you can solve with better light. It's the feeling that routine notices you back, and once it does, you carry the shape of that notice around in your pocket, like a key that doesn't open anything. If you've listened this far, thank you for keeping the night company. Be careful with the corners you look into and the doors you leave half open. They tend to remember the last person who passed through. Thank you for staying with me to the end. If these quiet stories keep you company at night, consider subscribing and sharing this with someone who likes the kind of unease that doesn't shout. I'd like to hear from you softly. If you like, have you ever felt a routine turn and look back at you? And did you keep driving or stop to listen? Sleep well.